Okay, I think we should get going because I think the academic 5 minutes have passed. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this event organized by the Tocqueville program and co-sponsored by the Ostrom workshop. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul Dragos Aligica back to Bloomington. Paul is a graduate of our department, actually, and he is currently a senior research fellow at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Mercatus Center at the George Mason University. Paul came to IU from a number of other previous institutions where he amassed an amazing number of degrees. I will not go over most of them, but I will say that he's a long friend from my Romanian past, so what brings us together here is a shared interest in liberty, which we learned live, as it were, under real communism, not academic communism, practiced by some of our colleagues. The topic that will be our subject for today is the Bloomington School, created by Lina and Vincent Ostrom, and it is a particular honor for me to welcome you in this beautiful room where the Tocqueville portrait is hanging, as a tribute to the outstanding work provided and made possible by the generous framework created by Lina and Vincent Ostrom. Paul has, his latest book is entitled Institutional Economy and Political Economy, the Ostroms and Beyond, and it is a tribute to what we call, and we proudly call, the Bloomington School, that is acknowledged today by scholars around the world and by all of those who have been associated with the works of Lina and Vincent Ostrom and worked under them at some point in their career. The topic of today's talk will be exactly this: institutional diversity and political economy, the Ostroms and Beyond. And from what I get, Paul will make some comments about the importance of the Ostrom's works and what we can learn from their institutional legacy today. I'm particularly happy to invite Paul to speak. We'll have some questions after his presentation. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Aligica to Bloomington.
Thank you very much, Aurelian. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank all of you for joining me in this conversation. It is a privilege to be back, my intellectual family, and be part of the ongoing conversation about the nature and the future of the research program of the epistemic community of the School of Thought that we know as the Ostrom's work, the Bloomington School. The event has been presented and introduced as a lecture, and my strategy is this. Actually, I would like to use this book and a couple of remarks as a vehicle for a conversation. So it would be as a starting point for a conversation with you about this very topic, the very idea of a school of thought in social sciences, moral sciences, political and social philosophy, about the organization of scientific research, and about the ways in which we could use the very institutional analysis tools that we have built up here at the workshop in order to better understand the nature of our enterprise and the operating environment of our enterprise. That is to say, in order to understand better the strategies that we are dealing with in the broader ecology of organizations that are participating in the intellectual division of labor and the production and distribution of social sciences knowledge. So this is my broad approach. Now, I'm going to do that in 3 or maybe 4 steps. And the first step would be simply to discuss the very idea of a school of thought in social political sciences. The very idea of an epistemic community, or whatever label we want to attach to the reality of the kind of phenomenon that we are dealing with and actually we are part of. Then I'm going to apply some insights from this broader discussion or analysis of the very idea of a school of thought to the very workshop experiment. And from there, I'm going to do two other things, and I'm trying to do all of this very fast because, like I said, my intention is to use my comments as a starting point for a conversation. So I'm going to do two other things. First of all, I'm going to overview a couple of underlying themes that actually are part of my book, that are supporting the structure, the logical structure, the argument structure of this book. And at the same time, by outlining those themes, those perspectives that are specific, I would say, to the Bloomington approach, to articulate a sort of intellectual profile, the distinctiveness of the kind of intellectual enterprise that, for now, between ourselves, let's call it the Bloomington School. And then I'm going to briefly take a look at each of the chapters of my book, just to give you a sense how those chapters are capturing those specific features that I'm going to outline as distinctive for our enterprise, and at the same time to try to show how we could open up conversations, bridges with other schools of thought, other perspectives, in the broader division of labor and conversation, which is the current landscape of social sciences and moral and political philosophy. So let me start this conversation with a fact, and this fact is the very emergence at the beginning of the 80s of what has been labeled the Bloomington School by the researchers that were familiar with the developments at the boundary between economics, political science, public administration, and social philosophy. So that's a fact. And as you could see, the flagship journal of public choice, which was the public choice revolution as we know it, that has changed a little bit the ways we understand applied economics and political science in the meanwhile. So the flagship journal, Public Choice, in '88 recognized the distinctiveness of the Bloomington School and compared it and contrasted it with other schools of thought, two others that we know very well now, the Virginia School of Buchanan and Tullock and Riker School. Now, again, so that was a fact by then, and in the meanwhile, we know how things have evolved. The Bloomington School, the research program here, the School of Thought, has become one of the most successful such enterprises in social and political sciences in general. The fact that a Nobel Prize in economics is associated with this experiment, and the fact that Vincent has received for his work in public administration a lifetime achievement award, the Dragos of the public administration, are just a couple of examples to demonstrate what happened in the meanwhile. So again, these are facts, but as we know, facts are interpretable. People have different interpretations of these facts. So the challenge is this: does it make sense to continue to discuss in the current epistemological climate of opinion landscape of social sciences, academia, about schools of thought, about epistemic communities, about communities of scholars have a sort of distinctive culture, approach, perspective, a distinct profile? When you know that so much of the research done currently is basically verifying with various tools and approaches specific propositions, sentences in a logical and empirical structure. Does it make sense to think about such enterprises as legitimate? Now, you know that these are not rhetorical questions, because we know that by the time that it became clear with the Nobel Prize that something important and interesting was happening here in Bloomington at the workshop, we know that we had two types of reactions. Some people said, Ostrom whom? Leonor whom? And others were saying, what school? What Bloomington? What is this nonsense of a Bloomington School? So here, I'm responding to a challenge when I'm opening up as an opening remark. And I'm responding to this challenge in the following way. I'm simply going to the existing literature and the research programs that were dedicated in the last 30 years or so to the very idea of community of scientists, of the very idea of the epistemological and sociology of science approaches to understand how social science, political science, moral science, philosophy are operating in the real life, as opposed to the conceptual reconstructions of those in formal and logical way. And I'm giving you just a sample of the various works that I think, again, it's a sample, and they are representing various traditions of research that they have looked in the field using various conceptual structures and approaches in order to understand what the heck is going on with these communities of scholars that are creating these communities dealing with social sciences and political sciences. And we have, for instance, Randall Corrins, the great sociologist, writing around 1,000 pages, using case studies of schools of thought in philosophy, but as case studies in order to better understand the structure and the dynamics of these communities and their institutional basis and organizational basis. Then we have the movement in social epistemology. But again, it's trying to understand the growth of knowledge, epistemology as a social process, and try to redefine and integrate previous approaches to the philosophy of social sciences and epistemology in an institutional framework, cultural framework, sociological framework, and thus to get a more realistic understanding of what's happening when we are creating science, social scientific theories, interpretations, analysis, and applications. And then indeed we have the great Abbott, Andrew Abbott from the University of Chicago, doing work precisely on the nature of department and discipline as units of analysis in this broader division of labor, in this broader ecology of various organizational forms and approaches to the production and distribution of knowledge. Now, what is the conclusion of all these converging things that are happening in the last 30 years or so? Emphasis goes on the social and institutional character of knowledge, the inter-individual epistemic relation, and the importance of epistemic communities. This is what they call the naturalized epistemology perspective, to understand the standard, the classical questions about epistemology in this social and institutional context. The distinctiveness of the various approaches, as opposed to one homogenized way of applying the scientific method, is emerging as a clear empirical and analytical finding of this literature. So we have a division of labor between various people specializing in different areas, and we have collaboration and competition. Now, by now, we see where this literature is going. We are at the workshop. They're going in the direction of reconstructing, from a different perspective, the very concept of polycentricity. And now we are stepping back and we remember that actually, who was the first person who coined this term? Polanyi. And then from there, Vincent and others picked up the term. But he was applying the term initially to what? To science. Right.
Not Karl Polanyi.
No, Michael Polanyi, yes, Michael Polanyi. Not Karl, his brother.
The good one.
And a good one. We are talking only good people here. So the bad people go unmentioned. We just don't mention their names. We mention their ideas, and we criticize them. But anyway, you see the direction it's going in understanding this very idea of a school of thought, of epistemic community, of an organizational structure of science, in ways that go beyond the standard positivistic approach to understanding the growth of knowledge. And with that, I would say the very idea of a school of thought or epistemic community or organization like this is validated. So this is the first response. In the meanwhile, we have a better understanding of how science is proceeding, and to question the very idea of a school of thought or epistemic community is to question the very foundation of the modern organization of science, is to have a naive view, a sort of post-Renaissance romantic view of those pictures of the scientist alone in the room, trying to get the insight in the very metaphysical essence of nature by sheer concentration or whatever the image was there. Now, one may say, look, you have validated the very idea of a school of thought, or whatever the label you want to apply to that reality. But that doesn't mean that you have validated the Bloomington School, right? A lot of those features that you have described might not apply to the Bloomington School. Well, my response to that is this. I go back to Collins. I have mentioned Collins's book, this one. At the end of the book, he's putting up together a couple of features of what might be the features of a successful school of thought or research program. And if you're going step by step, and I'm not going to do that right now, you would see that what happened at Bloomington is almost a textbook case of a successful organizational experiment in creating a new type of organizational formula in the broader division of labor, of the larger epistemic community. Take step by step. I'm not going to get into details because you're all familiar with these things. We have an institutional structure here, a very well, a physical plant school, how people call this infrastructure here. We have a distinctive epistemic community. It's international. It's huge. And it's very dedicated to this research program. The workshop is a demonstration of the power of this epistemic community. You have a social network of scholars that is operating in functional relationship with the rest of the academic community, as opposed to looking like a sect, looking like a dogmatic group that is bickering at the boundaries of the academic community. Our academic network is fully engaged with the rest of the academic community in the division of an important feature for a successful, again, so these are important features which literature build up as a sort of normative or if one institutional design principle, so to speak. Okay, so there is a substantive part of the work, and this is something that I'll be discussing later, the intellectual profile. It's distinctive. It's something there that could not be reduced to a formulaic approach, could not be reduced to a sort of broader research design or philosophy of social science. There is something distinctive about that, and the rest of my discussion, my presentation will be focused on that. But before that, let me also mention that the internal dynamics of the community was managed in ways that on the one hand were consistent and on the other hand allowed the diversity of opinion, perspectives, theories, philosophies to flourish within this. So yet another feature of successful and resilient school of thoughts or such organization. And last but not least, we have founding figures which were preeminent, selling. They have a sort of charisma that is very important for such. So again, you may take this list, you may improve it, you may tinker with it, but the bottom line is this. We look at that literature, we look at this literature, we derive some conclusions about the institutional design of this kind of organization, and we realize actually that we are in the midst of an important organizational and institutional and epistemic experiment with the Ostroms. So if you imagine the ecology of various organizations, let's speak in terms of organizational ecology. We have here, let's start a sort of experiment, sort of mutation that is generating something that is not akin to a department or to a discipline, and it's not the typical think tank, and it's not even the typical research institute. So it's a very interesting mixture of features, institutional, organizational culture, perspective, and substantively the intellectual profile that give the distinctiveness of this, let me call it for now, institutional experiment in the broader division of labor and ecology of the academic and intellectual environment. So it is a case study, and people are studying it. People outside Indiana University, I know for sure that they are studying it and try to replicate this. So this is something very important. Tinkering by design, sometimes by accident, the Ostroms managed to put together something very interesting, very powerful, very resilient, very successful by all standards. So this is my response to the various challenges raised on this front to the very idea of the Bloomington School. And this is precisely what my book is about. So I pick up this reality, this fact, and then I'm looking at the series of approaches, themes, issues, interpretations, concepts that I think are very promising as future steps on the intellectual profile, as I have mentioned, the intellectual profile, I'm not talking in this book about the institutional structure, about the epistemic community, about the organizational culture and other things that pertain to the broader sociology and institutional analysis of the research program. I am focusing only on the intellectual substance of that. And now I'm going to move to the third step of my approach, which is to briefly outline 7 features that I think give the distinctiveness, intellectual, analytical distinctiveness of our research program. Now you may say, look, each of those features separate might be shared with other research approaches. I might say, yeah, you may be right. But keep in mind, this is a combinatorial, as any identity is a combination of features. And the identity comes from the specific combination of features and the facets that they are creating together. So the sum is larger than those parts. Yet, I'm going to claim that many of those features are pretty unique, at least for now, to our kind of approach. Second, most of these features have been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and challenged by some people. So this is a second reason I'm going to outline those features. But while doing that, keep in mind that basically this is the underlying theme of this book, those features. And then I'm going to show you the contents of the book and briefly tell you how each chapter is capturing some of that and also is extending the dialogue and challenge to other schools of thought, approaches, and so on. So this is the program for the next 20 minutes or so, and then by that point, I think that we'll be able to move to the conversation. Hopefully, I'll be as efficient as I hope to be. Now, let me start with the first feature of the school. But again, keep in mind that the combination of these features is the most important thing. And by the end of my presentation, I think that we'll be able to discover that there is an underlying logic connecting all these things together. It's not just a pure combination of stuff that gives that distinctiveness, but also the underlying logic that is emerging as a result of putting those things together. So the first of them, again, I'm not going to preach to the choir here. It's a neither Marcus nor state thing, and as you know, that the basic idea is there that Ostroms challenged us to think beyond the two models of the state and of the market, Leviathan and invisible hand. And with that, they challenge us to think about the variety of ways in which people coordinate, cooperate, generate rule-guided behavior, and the variety of institutions that are emerging as a result of that. That has huge implications. That has huge implications for the applied level, for public administration, public policy, for governance theory. And I'm going in the next slide to present the second feature, which is precisely that. But before moving there, let me say this. A lot of people are misunderstanding this. Bizarre as may seem to you, people feel very comfortable to fall back either to the state model or to the market model. They start with the Ostrom arguments, but sooner or later they want to go back to the much more familiar territory, which is the simple model of the market and the simple model of the state. So in a sense, they resist the messiness of institutional diversity. And some people we're talking about the Ostroms in this biological diversity, the explorers identifying this institutional form and cataloging that institutional form. There are not many people that are fully understanding the consequences of that. And some of those consequences are very important for governance theory. So we could derive from the very idea of institutional diversity very important governance theory, because you could see human diversity, the diversity of human beliefs, values, preferences, and so on, is reflected in institutional diversity. And institutional diversity and human diversity have to be somehow accounted in the theory of governance. And this is precisely what the Ostroms have done in their work on public administration, in their work on governance in general, and by building up the concept of polycentricity, which is an attempt to put some order in this institutional diversity, multi-level institutional diversity. And again, I'm not going to preach to the choir. We are all familiar with this beautiful way of describing by Lin of the very concept of polycentricity, both as a positive analytical model, a theoretical lens which you use in order to understand reality, but also as a normative. A way that organize societies in order to get very desirable results using various institutional criteria. Out of that emerges again on the normative side. Oh, hold on, let me go back. So polycentricity, is this a concept that is misunderstood? I think so. A lot. Many people associated it and try to say, okay, so this is nothing new in comparison with federalism or other ways of describing the area. So again, it's an ongoing conversation. We could continue to explore this way of misunderstanding. For now, I'm just mentioning that the concept of polycentricity is crucial, is important, and also it's a misunderstood concept. And a lot of work has to be done in order to get a better sense of where the concept should be positioned in the literature, in the conversation with the other schools of thought. But one important normative, especially normative implication of the concept of polycentricity, institutional diversity, this idea of governance, is to challenge the dominant theory of the 20th century of seeing like a state in governance and seeing like a state in social sciences. And we have here a very beautiful position statement of Lin's, in which she says, basically, look, we are contributing here to a cumulative knowledge for citizens and self-governance. And if we fail to do that, to pass that knowledge to the citizens for self-governance, we have failed in everything else. Doesn't matter how sophisticated theoretical models you have, doesn't matter how sophisticated you are in your empirical analysis and the results that you are doing. If you are failing to pass that knowledge to citizens, that is a huge failure of ours, and everything that we are doing is basically meaningless. So this is a very strong normative perspective, seeing like a citizen, sort of Tocquevillian perspective associated with a Tocquevillian perspective. And it's a challenge to the mainstream approach, which is basically is positioning the viewer at the top of the society, by definition somehow monocentrically defined, or preparing the social scientist as an advisor to the prince. Ostrom's challenge, that perspective. This is not the Council of Economic Advisors perspective that is emerging from their perspective. It's a profound paradigm change that I don't think that we have captured so far the entire magnitude of this challenge in our approaches. And again, misunderstood, because we could see a lot of people that take as a starting point the Ostroms and then they go back to the seeing like a state perspective. Next, the Ostroms have seen this type of approach as part of ongoing conversation in the history of political and social thought, right? They say there's something that started with Aristotle. We are contributing to a sort of evolutionary knowledge base that is growing, and it's a separate discussion about the various interpretations that Vincent has given to this growth of knowledge perspective. But the bottom line is this: this is not just a hypothesis testing perspective that is developed here. This is not just an empirical research program that happened to be very successful because it focused at the right moment and the right time. It is designed from the very beginning at the underlying assumption to be part of a larger tradition and the growth of knowledge of human society, a discussion and an approach to self-governance. And then you could see already how the connections between these features, these predicate features, with seeing like a citizen, with polycentricity, institutional diversity, are emerging. But this is important to keep in mind. It's a conversation that starts with Aristotle and continues to the founding fathers, Tocqueville, obviously, and then is extended in the 20th century by introducing into the conversation the insights of social sciences and economics that have been generated in the meanwhile in the neoclassical revolution, and then the emergence of public administration as a separated field, and the developments in political science and so on. So it's updating this contributing to that. Now, I'm going to go to something very controversial. I think that many people are misunderstanding the Ostrom approach. Do you remember when the Nobel Prize winning has been announced? We had people like Krugman, who had no idea what was going on, but then we had nice people in the economics, like Romer, Mankey, and so on. And what did they say? Oh, look, this is a very good empirical research program, and so on. Well, if you take a second look at the Ostrom's approach, and especially if you go at this strategies of political inquiry, you'd discover something fascinating. What was the concern? What was the approach? Their approach and their concern with the language of data analysis and method is dominating the language of theory construction. The practice of, another concern, the practice of placing the questions of how to describe political relationships in a quantitative manner over an adequate approach to the word of inquiry. I'll be more specific about that. But for now, I just wanted to mention this fact, the primacy of theory. And if you are looking at the Ostrom's work, you could see that actually that was the main thing. And the empirical approach was an extension of the primacy of theory. And you will never see Lean as radical and as outspoken, critical, as in the preface of this book, attacking, challenging the positivistic and neo-positivistic mainstream for their approaches. And I picked up some references here, but go to the justice. So she is criticizing the rock bottom approach, the Popperian rock bottom approach, in which you are piling up data and how somehow out of those data something would be emerging. Then she's criticizing the recruitment and socialization of students that are trained to do quantitative analysis, having absolutely no idea of philosophy, logic, even mathematics. And as a result of that, what is that? A know-nothing era in the discipline. So they are very strong words. And again, I'm not going to go into this. I'm just using these codes to see that to make the point that this is not my interpretation, it's not your interpretation. So this is what actually the core tradition of the workshop is. And again, it is very important because we see these waves of in the evolution of the discipline that go from one extreme to another, and we could see how the Ostroms have tried to keep a sort of moderated, a balanced perspective on things. Please.
Oh yes. What about case studies? So there's primacy of theory over analysis. I remember in 2011, her graduate students and I were working on a wiki page to kind of define terms like institution and these kinds of things. And she wanted to be very clear that the case studies of how we get this information are more important than theories, because even the term institution is so defined in different theories. If you start defining it that way, there's a problem. But if you look at the case studies and then catalog exactly how it's used in each of those things. So I think for this point, are we just talking about the primacy of theory over data analysis, or the primacy of theory over case study approach?
Look, this is an interesting and important question. The first step has to be made by recognizing the nature of the problem, that it is not something that we should be simply glossing over, assuming that we know what this research program is about by simply defining it as a sort of empirical case study, gathering of data on common pool resources and this and that. Second, definitely, and I'm going in the next slides to discuss to discuss precisely that, there is a balance between the empirical reality and the conceptual structures that we are using in order to approach that reality. And I think that if you are looking at the Ostrom's work, you could see, and again, I'm going to go in the next slides precisely to that, a sort of practice-oriented approach, as opposed to a dogmatic approach to answering those questions. I think that that's actually one of my next slides. So we are in the field, we are working together, and we are receiving all these challenges, empirical, epistemological, theoretical, and we have to somehow work them out. And we don't have one-size-fits-all solution. So this is my first, my first reaction to that. We should see the Ostromian perspective as a sort of practical approach in terms of methodology, theory, pluralistic approach, and also related to the very challenge of the case in point that you have to study. I'm going to go probably in the next slide exactly to that. Yes. So the next couple of slides will be a sort of extension and attempt to further answer your challenge. Or this challenge, because it's not only your challenge, it is a challenge about the way we understand the very nature of theory in social sciences. Now, it is not only about the primacy of theories, I think, but it is also about a specific way of understanding theory. And let's make a step back here in order to understand the context. We have probably one of the most successful and very well endowed with resources and human capital research program in social sciences in the history. And this is the research program on collective action. A lot of the stuff here was part of this larger thing that has started in the 60s with Mansur Olson, The Logic of Collective Action, Garrett Harding, and so on. And we have people piling up theoretical resources and empirical resources in order to understand the riddle of the theory of collective action and the solution of the collective action. Now, that was that. We have this process, and at the end, after 30 years or so, what are the results of this line of research? It depends. Depends on the circumstances, depends on the conditions. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. In other words, people like Lynn or people like Pamela Oliver, who's developing a parallel research direction, reached the conclusion that there is no one problem of collective action, no one theory of collective action, no one solution to the problem of collective action. And that a lot of stuff depends on the circumstances, on the context. Now, this is huge. Think of this. The most well-endowed, powerful, one of the most research programs in modern social sciences reaches conclusions that are challenging the very epistemological foundations that we started at the beginning to operate with, which were the sort of covering law, general theory of the positivistic and neo-positivistic perspective. Now, this is huge. What are you going to do in such circumstances? By now, as you know, we have an Oxford Handbook for contextual analysis. This is, again, challenging it's not just a methodological issue, it's not just a theoretical issue. It's a challenge to the very idea we are thinking about our theories and the nature of our theories in the way we confront reality. So this is why I postponed a little bit the discussion about the dialogue between reality and sure, the case study is important because that's where the context is. And if context matters, then we have to develop a specific relationship between the case and the conceptual apparatus that we are using in that specific case. Moreover, both Lynn, Pamela Oliver, and the other people that were participating in this long research program started to think about theoretical scenarios or a sort of combinatorial analysis that looks at how exogenous variables combine to affect endogenous structural variables, and to start to think about putting together theoretical scenarios as opposed to trying to uncover covering laws and generalizations, big generalizations about human. And this has, again, extraordinary implications for the very idea we are understanding social sciences, institutional design. And I don't think that at this point people have caught up with this challenge. Yet, Lynn is opening an insight about what that might be meaning. And look at this thing here. This line of research ends up confronting us with a word of possibility rather than a word of necessity. That is to say, we are neither trapped in tragedies, unavoidable tragedies, or social dilemmas and so on, nor free of moral responsibility of how we are dealing with those issues. So she is blowing away at this point, both analytically and normatively, the positivistic, neo-positivistic, and all other spin-offs of that approach to social sciences. Look at this. It's moral responsibility is built up on the same line that we remember from Vincent's work at the moral inquiry, the line of moral inquiry. And the idea of responsibility obviously is there. And the idea of possibility, the space of the possible, as opposed to the space of the necessary, which is the one that we should be focusing on. Again, as you know, there is a division of labor in social sciences, moral science, and so on between ideal theory, which is the space of the desirable, and then we have the space of the feasible, which for us is institutional design, and then is the space of the possible, which is the applied level. Might be feasible, but might not be possible in those specific circumstances. You could see how the Ostroms are pushing our approach in the direction of thinking issues not in terms of ideal types, desirable, necessary, but from the other way round, from the possible to the feasible, and then to the desirable. Again, huge contribution, and I think that people are far for catching up with these insights. And again, it is not a fancy philosophical speculation. These are the outcomes of the very concrete empirical research work done on case studies in the lab, in the field, statistical analysis on one of the most powerful and influential research programs in history of humankind, which is the collective action program. Next step. Obviously, it's exactly what I was mentioning, the priority of practice and the very idea of these communities of people involved in practical challenges. If you take a look at political theory, social theory, economics, not from the perspective of ideal theory or foundational theory, and then to move in the direction of practice, which is the standard practice. People are building up those theories and then say, oh, okay, and now go take them, apply them. Nobody is, most cases, picking up the theories to be applied. Those terms have done the other way around. They have looked at various challenges, social dilemmas, problems, and so on, and moved from there, from the applied side, from the practical side. So it's a profound, in many respects, pragmatic approach, and this is one of the points that I'm making in this book. And I'm going to give an example, just one example of this practical approach, because again, I think it's a very misunderstood issue in the hermeneutics, in the interpretation of the school. And it's working together, the book. So this is what the co-authors, pivoting around Lynn's perspective, are saying. We are particularly troubled by professional norms and career incentives that discourage collaboration and multi-method, this is, working together, research, and fail to acknowledge the practical challenges that affect the methodological perspective. So on the one hand, we have the approach where we have the research design, which is like set in stone, and it's the ideal thing, and then we have an approach which recognizes the challenges, the practical challenges, even at the level of methodology. Next, we recognize that our concerns with practical constraints on methodological practices depart somewhat from those of most recent publications on research design. But then they say, this is not a methods book. And as you know, most people read that book as a methods book. That book is not a methods book. This is what that book says. Again, we are talking about the practical approach, even at the level of methodology, of this pragmatic contextual thing and the challenge that we have to absorb and deal with. Okay, so scholars should start with the research question and then select methods. Not start with the methods and their research goals. And look at this, their ontological assumptions about causality. You have some ontological assumptions about causality, so you have to assume those in your approach to the research practice. Now, it might be a mismatch between the ideal, however that ideal might be defined, and actual methodological practices, the kind of stuff that you are forced to do in the field or in the lab. But that might happen not because scholars are ignoring the principles of research design or somehow logical positive perspective, but because this is exactly what practice is. So, if we ignore that practical challenge, we are basically creating a situation in which our research approach, our research strategy would be ineffective. So, and this is what is the concern of this author and this, the effectiveness in our research approach as opposed to one dogmatic perspective about research method and so these are 7 features, like I said, in my view and in this book are underlying the underlying. Let me take 5 more minutes or 6 more minutes and as a result of this, we could see a sort of profile emerging. And I'm not going to go over some implicit features of this profile, all of them, but just one of them, which is the pluralism of this approach. It's a pluralist, methodological pluralism, a theoretical pluralism, it's normative pluralism. The diversity of people organizing in various ways, using different rules and using different criteria for institutional performance or the social good in what. It's sociological pluralism, recognizing the very sociological fact of diversity, of heterogeneity. And obviously it is institutional and governance pluralism, polycentricity, institutional diversity. So this is an all-in-all pluralistic perspective. And this is the starting point of my book. These are the underlying themes, and then in each of these chapters, I am focusing from different angles on some aspects of this intellectual landscape, while at the same time trying to engage with other debates, other schools of thought, people that are either converging with their assumptions and conclusions and approaches with the kind of work that we are doing here, or they are challenging our approach. And I'm doing this step by step. In the first chapter, obviously institutional diversity, heterogeneity, I am engaging with the work, as you know, Scott Page's work on diversity, with Jerry Gauss and the University of Arizona, people that are focusing on the philosophical foundations of pluralism and diversity. And I'm trying to show that we are building here the institutional design and institutional analysis side of their more ideal theory or philosophical, so there are like 2 pillars that are coming and are converging under a broader framework discussing the problem of heterogeneity. In the second chapter, obviously, we are discussing polycentricity, and discussing polycentricity, we have to confront the nested governance, federalism, competitive governance, and third-party governance. And with that, we have to engage with people that are doing with that kind of work. I have forgotten to mention the Maryland group, the Good Society, with the civics and third sector governance. But mostly I engage with Jack Knight and Jim Johnson, who in their recent book, The Priority of Democracy, somehow challenge our perspective and set up a set of normative criteria for what they call second-order institutions, institutions that somehow are governing the first-order institutions. And I try to show that based on their own criteria, our concept of polycentricity satisfies all the features that they are using for a priority of democracy and even more. So it's an ongoing debate between the centralizers, the monocentric perspective, and the pluralist perspective, the checks and balances perspective that we are representing somehow in this debate, and I try to engage with that. Then, institutional mapping and the framework. Obviously, engaging with people that are doing heuristics, the context of discovery as opposed to the context of justification. And they say the context of justification is this discussion about testing theories, how you justify the truth value of a proposition that has emerged. But, as we have mentioned at the beginning, a lot of social science and science in general, it's in the context of discovery. And the framework is a meta-level mapping for instrument for, in this interpretation here, for social spaces. So I engage with Abbott, Nancy Cartwright, and the discussion about evidence-based policy is relevant. But again, so these are either challenges or trying to engage with other communities in our strategy. Institutional resilience and institutional theory. Two dimensions there. First of all, sure, socio-ecological systems. Discussions about resilience coming from that literature, obviously very important. A highly optimized tolerance, Carson and Doyle, Banerjee, Hollings, and that. But also trying to say that, look, this is resilience discussion is a discussion also very important for comparative economic systems. Because the concept of resilience was missing in the comparative economic systems where they're looking at efficiency, social justice, freedom, and so on and so forth, but they have all forgotten about the concept of resilience, which seemed to be very important in understanding the Soviet collapse. Institutional design, again, so it's an attempt to think about the relationship between ideas, rules, and social change and social order. Try to obviously Gurin, who is an institutional design at the interface between the feasibility discussion and ideal theory. Then the Max Planck people, especially Christoph Engel, who wrote a book exactly on this interpretation of institutions as devices of dealing with uncertainty via belief systems. Obviously, Doug North. I mean, we know that there are like 3 or 4 or 5 Doug North in the history of so the latest Doug North on belief systems and so on. And last but not least, it's institutionalism and pragmatism. As I have mentioned, such an approach that is based on practice, on the primacy of practice, on the context, and so on, and that is challenging the mainstream, the positivism or neo-positivism, or the implications of that assumed from the air without any kind of deeper understanding of that, has somehow to gravitate toward a sort of pragmatist perspective. And I engaged with that discussion and that literature, showing that in my interpretation, and again, everything obviously it's somehow my interpretation of these things, the Ostromian perspective gravitates toward the pragmatic approach. Now, to wrap it up, a certain understanding, institutional understanding, is emerging about the nature of the research process, about the organization of scientific inquiry, about the epistemic communities, and so on. And if we are applying the Ostromian perspective to that, we understand, we realize a couple of things. That indeed, this is a very powerful and interesting institutional and intellectual experiment in the larger division of labor, ecology, of competition, of cooperation, of research institutions and perspectives. And second, that it is very important to keep in mind the warnings that our research program has given about institutional monocropping, about the danger of having only one institutional form, one perspective in institutional design for the broader institutional performance and resilience of the system. So it might be the case that we could apply those insights from governance, public governance, natural resource governance, political structures, and so on, to our own community, the academic and the epistemic community. And we realize that actually what the Ostroms, the message of the Ostrom, is multifaceted and very important, and an important juncture in the evolution of our academic community. Message of pluralism of perspectives, of collaboration, division of labor, and competition across boundaries, in teams, socializing and creating networks and research groups, working together, being pragmatic in the field, and trying to be precise and technically competent in the execution of the various research plans and designs. So, all in all, I think that if you are stepping back and you take a look at this research program, and again, for the School of Thought, research program, epistemic community, doesn't matter. It looks like that something very important and valuable has happened here at Bloomington in the last 40 years or so. And that is even more important these days when we are looking at the trends, epistemic trends, methodological trends around, when we see the problem of diversity of methods and theories and so on is again on the table, as it was by the time when the Ostrom or Lean was writing the preface of on the strategies of inquiry. So this is in a nutshell my take. Again, it's obviously an interpretation, but there are some facts there. And we know that there is a sort of gray line between the facts and the various interpretations. But my hope is that I was closer in my interpretation to the core research tradition of the workshop than many of our critics are. And again, the book is an attempt to put together some of these themes and also to engage with the rest of the academic community and to continue the tradition of the Ostroms, who dared to be different in various circumstances, and by daring to be different, studying diversity, they have managed to put together this extraordinary experiment in innovation and institutional design and in intellectual creativity, which is the workshop. So these are my, I think that was a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I wanted to put on the table this interpretation of the Ostrom, of Ostrom's perspective, of the Ostrom workshop, and of the current challenges and perspectives that we have as bearers of this intellectual tradition.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I should like to point out, just as a sign of the tribute that Dragos has so nicely laid out to the Ostrom, that Lynn Ostrom managed to correct the proofs of this book a month before she passed away in May 2012. You can imagine someone facing her own death and finding time to correct the proofs of a book like this in the last month of her life. This tells a lot about the generosity that they put. I'd like to take two questions first and give a chance to Dragos to synthesize both of them. So, Jeff and Michael. And then we'll take two questions at a time to give time to people to ask.
Thank you. This was a great talk, and there's so many, it's very rich, and I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask one. And I'm going to try to be very brief, but I'm going to start with a brief vignette. Some of you may recall, so when I became chair of the political science department in 2003, I invited Bob Dahl to come and give the first Heinemann lecture that was given when I was chair. And there was a dinner, and at some point in the dinner, Dahl went off and basically hung out with Lynn and Vincent Ostrom for around a half an hour. And the truth is, Dahl was from Alaska, and Vincent had done a lot of work in Alaska. They didn't really know each other, but they actually had a lot in common, and they had an interesting conversation. Okay, that's the vignette. Here's the question. You nicely link the Ostromian notion of polycentricity with Polanyi. In my opinion, one of two really interesting brothers who really weren't that different in some ways. But in any case, Polanyi, Ostrom, polycentricity. And in the course of developing this theme, you talk a lot about pluralism. Okay. Now, interestingly, Dahl and Lindblom, in their book on politics, economics, and welfare, were writing about polyarchy in 1954. And in fact, Robert Dahl wrote a very famous book called Polyarchy, which was published in 1972. And in fact, probably if to the extent that people know about the intellectual history, if you went around and did a survey of American political scientists and asked them who is the most important pluralist theorist of the 20th century in American political science, they would say Robert Dahl. Mm-hmm. And yet, in your incredible and very nice account of what is a very rich tradition, in which you link them to lots of people like Jack Knight and Jim Johnson and whoever, no discussion of Dahl and Lindblom at all, particularly Dahl. And I'm not asking this question because I was a student of Dahl, but it's an interesting, so I regard this as a paradox. No, seriously, I'm not. In fact, my dissertation was a critique of Dahl. Right. I'm not, but it's a paradox. It's a question of intellectual history that may have other implications, like how is it that this very rich research, and it has, I think, something to do with the state, but I'm not going to answer the question. I'm asking the question. How is it that this incredibly rich discussion of polycentricity, polyarchy, pluralism, isn't in contact with this other very important tradition, which arguably, by the way, has had more influence on the development of the political science discipline than this one? It's just a question. That's my question.
Thank you. Mike?
Boy, Jeff's a tough act to follow. So I'm going to go to plan B, my second question, because I think it fits in with this a little bit better. Another area of research, particularly coming out of public administration, public management work, really focuses on looking at cross-sector governance. You mentioned something about third sector governance, stuff like that. And Ostrom, Tocqueville, and Warren I've always sort of seen as sort of a predecessor of a lot of that research. And yet, in much the same way that Dahl doesn't get mentioned in your work and in most of the work coming out of the Ostrom, that's just not a natural sort of connection. Those guys don't talk about the Ostroms or anything, exactly. In the public management sort of thing, and vice versa. I never really picked up any of that around the workshop. It's when I started hanging around SPIA, different stuff, like a whole other sort of literature. So, and you started your talk off with about the importance of connecting to other kinds of literature. So I think Jeff's identified a literature in political science that this school has not connected to as well as it could have, and I'm arguing there's another school in public management that's not connected to. So what, and they seem like natural fits to pluralism or to networks or government. So what was it that kept those connections? So it's much the same question.
Plan B is good.
Okay, so let me start from there and then go to the first question. It happens that I'm looking exactly at this challenge, and indeed in the public administration literature you have this, what they call now governance or new public management thing, which is basically Ostromian if you are looking at the kind of solutions and the kind of diagnosis that they are using. And then they are not using the Ostroms, they are not claiming the Ostroms at all, though they were the pioneers in the 70s, and the metropolitan governance debate was exactly about this. So if you are looking at the new literature, it is emerging here in the States, but also in Scandinavian countries, mostly in Europe, you could see a sort of point-by-point a list of insights and solutions given by the Ostroms in the 70s. Now, how do I interpret that? I think that this is, again, I think that it was the reaction to Vincent's position in the broader context of public administration in the 70s. So the intellectual crisis of public administration has created a lot of waves in the discipline, but also a lot of resentment. And also his association, and at one point Lynn's association with the public choice movement, was very critical to public administration in many respects, both analytically and normatively, also somehow put them in the position to be not much trusted by the mainstream public administration. However, as things have moved forward in a better understanding of the challenges in the field, in public administration, people started to align exactly to those kind of insights that are requiring an increasingly self-governance, partnership, hybridity in those solutions. So it was more or less a forced by reality development in the field of public administration. And then we see finally Vincent recognized by the public administration when they revisited his work, and they have decided that actually he has very important contributions. So this is my interpretation on that line, and I see it currently converging, those two things, and I see the people in public administration now redefined as public governance or governance studies or new public management as opposed to public administration. I see those people claiming increasingly the legacy of the Ostroms and the theoretical apparatus and the clout that comes with being associated obviously with a Nobel Prize winner. Now, as regarding the other line of research, I'm not so sure about my position on that. There might be two things. First of all, it was a failure of mine, my personal failure in fully understanding the intellectual history of the relationship between the two.
No, it's not about your book. These people didn't know each other until they met here in 2003.
No, but Jeff, my point is this: I could see references here and there to Dahl's work in Vincent in Vincent's stuff. So why is not the connection stronger? Why is not this concept of polycentricity and polyarchy closer articulate? I think it's just a challenge for our generation. Now we are looking at the concept of polycentricity and try to see what's going on with these two related concepts and what is happening there. So I don't have a very clear answer, as opposed that I think that I have in this case, because I could trace back. I looked into the literature, I did sort of content. Literature review, not content analysis, of the public administration textbooks and the main interpretations of the field starting with the 70s until the 90s. And I could back up everything that I have said about these reactions with textual evidence. In this case, I do not have that. I have just this, this concern that I've always had, that for some reason I wasn't able to capture correctly maybe a sort of archival work. I know, for instance, from the Buchanan archives at George Mason that you could see a lot of stuff that otherwise, from the open existing sources, you do not see about the evolution of a research program. It might be the case that if we're taking a second closer look at especially Vincent's take in the 60s, developing this line with Tocqueville and Oren, that is different from the one that you have mentioned, you might be finding some reasons there. I know that you suggested that might be something to do with the state and a sort of normative positioning. I think that you might be very well right, because we know that the public choice revolution Vincent was part of had a sort of normative undertone in that respect. So I do not have that.
I just want to clarify the
Sure.
question, because my point wasn't what was wrong with the Ostroms at all.
Yeah.
In fact, what's interesting is simply that there are two, in some ways, similar trajectories that are more parallel than intersecting. That's just an interesting question of intellectual and disciplinary history. It's not your job to... You wrote a great book. You don't have to answer every question.
No, I know, but I have discovered also the British tradition of pluralism.
Yes.
That is yet another thing. So if we want to put together a sort of pluralist position, and I think that we have to put it because the environment now is going in a certain direction, and I think that we won't be able to push the pluralist frontier. We have to defend it at this point. And we have to gather all forces on the pluralist front for at least 1 or 2 generations to keep this thing alive. And I think that we have to gather all those resources coming from different perspectives and to build up the defense line of pluralism for, like I said, I think, again, I might be misinterpreting the climate of opinion, but my impression is that we did exactly this kind of intellectual and conceptual reconstruction has to be made, and not only on that line, but also a couple of other pluralist perspectives that are out there without actually leading anywhere in the end, just hanging there to be picked up and used in the context of.
Good. I'd like to take 3 questions next.
Sorry.
Eduardo, Dan, and Federica.
Thank you so much. This was great. I wanted to, first, it's not a question. I want to just share one thing that came as you were talking. And since you mentioned Andrew Abbott,
Yes.
which is the psychic and emotional aspect that allowed everything, all of this to develop. And Abbott, I think, in a book called, I think, Methods of Discovery,
Methods of
he
discovery.
talks about the quality of puzzlement.
Yeah.
That legitimate quality of being interested in inquiring about things. And he also talks about the intellectual personality, the ability to recognize weakness and strengths, not only do things for the professional sake of doing things or status and so forth. So I think this is, as a foundational aspect of it, that is as important as any others, and it came to my mind as you're talking. The point that I want to make, I really like the way you talk about the theoretical scenarios as a proxy to frameworks, I guess, which is a term that we use much more. And I think theoretical scenarios is a really nice alternative. I wonder if more attention should be given to in that part, I guess, to the effort to develop or to collaboratively develop a lexicon of concept terms and that are really important foundations for how it's taught, how it's practiced, and that we use so much. The rules of grammars, the bundles of rights, and so forth. And I think that's a very important part of the school today that deserves to be highlighted in many ways. Thank you so much.
Yeah, building on that, the way Lynn at least once described the framework, the ID framework is a meta-theoretical conceptual map. I think really fits in well with what Edu just mentioned. I want to return to Jeff's question a bit, just to put a little historical context, right? When Ostrom, Tocqueville, and Warren didn't know about Polanyi when they published in '61. And it was only later, right? It was Vincent's piece published in Mike's volume.
I think they cited it, but...
No, they didn't cite it. Vincent said in his Polycentricity 1 paper in your volumes that they were unaware and it was an important oversight on their part. So they only took him on board, or Vincent took him on board in the 70s. Right. Lynn, you mentioned that Vincent had cited Dahl. Lynn cited Lindblom on occasion, but it just seems like they never intersected enough, perhaps personally or professionally, to realize that they were running along sort of parallel tracks or working the same side of the street, for another analogy.
somewhat in between. I wonder if you could say more about how you see engaging diverse epistemological communities work in practice. And Eduardo was mentioning the idea of creating a common language or creating a common framework. And I wonder to what extent is this task or goal like a self-defeating like part of a self-defeating movement towards like not being a distinctive community to begin with. And perhaps this is like too philosophical to be even relevant. But I wonder like where you see the, in order to not reinvent the wheel every 30 years, which is what I think Jeff was kind of like pushing like, or winking at, but also in order to maintain an intellectual specificity. Where do you draw the line between engaging and maintaining your specificity?
Good luck answering all three.
Yeah, well, let me start with Abbott. Thank you so much for mentioning that. I mean, it's supporting exactly the type of approach that I think that we should be using in understanding the very nature of this type of scientific enterprises. Contrast that with a typical logical positivist perspective on the nature of science and the formulaic approach to scientific discovery in the context of discovery and the context of justification. So this is just one of the many ways in which one could better understand what is actually going on in the scientific practice as opposed to what it should be going on based on some abstract models that are derived from an abstract understanding of the logic of the scientific discovery. This is why they call the logical reconstruction or the conceptual reconstruction of science as opposed to the understanding of the past. So thank you so much for mentioning that. Second, about this, and this is related to the question about this idea of a lexicon, or the idea of creating a language. Now, we could see a tension here, right? Because the idea of a unified science, which is a positivist perspective, and the idea of consilience, of this converging of all disciplines and all sciences in only one, I think it's a little bit problematic in the light of exactly the kind of understanding that we have now about the nature of science. And yet, and this is, I think, the challenge, we know that Vincent especially was very, very careful and very preoccupied with the nature of words and concepts. Clear definition, the correct definition of them. But why was he so preoccupied? Because he said, look, in order to construct institutions, we use language. So our use of language is not just for descriptive reasons or analytical reasons and so on. It is the very basic building block of creating institutions, rules, and so on and so forth. So therefore, a sort of precision or a sort of lack of ambiguity of the words that we are using is important, again, not only for analytical reasons, but also for institutional design, institutional building, social cooperation and coordination purposes. So, again, this is something that I think that many people, so Vincent was stopping you after your first sentence and say, okay, so how we define state? Define state. And then that's a conversation stopper. We know that because you don't do that with those kind of things. Everybody's defining the state at the beginning, how the heck they consider that is necessary for the purposes of the operationalization of the research design, and then take it from there. That wasn't the case with Vincent, right, and this kind of approach, because your definition of the state actually was your practice of engaging, supporting, sustaining, creating, challenging the state. So that was that's why this lexicon has more than one interpretation or one So you could say I have a rather ambiguous position about this problem of how we engage, if I understood correctly, the question of how we engage the rest of the epistemic community around these concepts. On the one hand, we have this diversity of perspectives, which we know very, very clearly that is important for the resilience, robustness of the performance of an epistemic community. But on the other hand, we need these gravitation points for various reasons around some semantic structures and so on. So it's a balance there, difficult to answer. And to Dan's point, I think that yeah, I mean, based on my own, my own, this is my own interpretation of the. And this is interesting because so many people are rediscovering this polycentricity from different traditions, from different angles, sometimes having no idea that the others have already constructed or identified some facets of the phenomenon. So there is something out there. We may not like the way it is conceptualized, or may not like the interpretation that we are giving, but it's something out there. It's a phenomenon to be taken into account seriously.
We have time for another last set of questions, if there are any. I'd like to add one to the list. In your book, Dragos, you do mention the importance of pragmatism, as you mentioned in the outline, and you bring into the discussion the name of John Dewey. I know that Vincent was not a great fan of Dewey, but took Dewey seriously. So I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about the differences between the two approaches, Dewey as a major American pragmatist and Vincent taking into account the American pragmatist tradition, which is important.
Can I build on that too? By bringing in another American pragmatist, Peirce, and his concept of the abductive method, and which I see is very consistent with what Lynn and Vincent were trying to do, as opposed to anything inductive or deductive.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I'll throw what I was going to ask before Jeff sort of took me down another path. And I think it's related actually to these last two comments. Could you explain what you mean by a sort of a priority or a focus on possibilism as the foundation of the way they look at the world? In that's I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, sure.
And how that relates to what works versus.
It's indeed related to this pragmatist dimension. So let me take them one by one. First of all, Dewey. Indeed, Vincent was critical on the of the political theory, Deweyan political theory, for the preeminence that Dewey was giving to the state, and not very careful way of analyzing the concept, the implications, and so on. On the other hand, I think that there was, at least based on my interpretation, very close to a sort of core pragmatic approach. It starts with Peirce, abduction, this sort of construction of institutions as opposed to just spontaneous evolution of institutions. And I think that as a matter of intellectual history, I think that I could detect a lecture given here by the important at that point philosopher in the pragmatist tradition, Lewis, at Indiana University, and he published a booklet as a result of his conference given here at Indiana University. And I think that a lot of these ideas about the evolution of institutions, of the dynamic of institutions, and adaptive processes, and so on, were somehow, I mean, it's a speculation of mine, the result of being exposed to that later generation pragmatist perspective that was based in Dewey, in Peirce, and so on, but was pushing things in a new direction. So I think that there are multiple directions in which Vincent interacted with the tradition.
Are you talking about David Lewis?
No, C.I. Lewis, I think. I think that, not David Lewis, but though indeed it's obviously that you could go on, so given my ambiguity into the direction. No, it was a American pragmatist philosopher, but I think that he was also associated with the pragmatist diaspora of the Austrian and Germans coming in the 40s and the 50s here, that was trying to combine logical positivism with a sort of more pragmatic perspective. But he had a discussion in the context of the Cold War about democracy and the nature of adaptive nature, of learning nature of the institutions of democracy, and I think that that might be one of the. Now, this issue of possibilism. This is something that I think it's, at least in my view, a fascinating cutting edge of these developments in institutional theory that we have mentioned earlier. Because indeed, if context matters, and the range of the possible is defined by context, then we need to look what are the boundary conditions for various institutional arrangements. We know that there was such an experiment in thinking and in dealing with these issues at the beginning of the 20th century, which was the socialist calculation debate, where without having an empirical case study in the field, there was absolutely no socialist experiment at that point. Some authors, some scholars try to think about the boundaries of the possibility of a system as designed by those guys functioning in the space of the possible. And they reached the conclusion that as defined by those guys, the system won't be working. It's not possible. So this is the kind of line of approach. I don't have a very clear understanding of that, but I know and I see that current institutional analysis and the current work on these specific lines is pushing us to think about these issues. Because if context matters, why shouldn't I propose and also institutional diversity is so important, why shouldn't I propose a very far-fetched and very institutional experiment? It would be small, it would be here and so on. What are the limits, predefined limits of such experiments? Why shouldn't we experiment in many ways? What are the limits of the possible? Some of them are physical, and I think that the institutional analysis and development network helps us to understand the action arenas and the various parameters of such things. Yes.
Does this also relate to the sort of currently fashionable approach in political economy of the uncovered set?
Yeah. So I think that we are going there. That's why I'm saying that it's a cutting edge. And on the one hand, analytically, theoretically, in terms of the insights, we are getting there, while on the other hand, this obsession with method and the formulaic approaches is pushing us into other direction. And the concern is that the second one is getting the upper hand at this point, especially because of this big data thing going on there, and the fashionable and also very financially promising and social engineering promising perspective on that side. And yet, like I said, the frontier of the space of the possible and understanding the institutional diversity and how we experiment with institutional diversity in cases where we do not have an empirical track record is extremely important. Because if we want to make progress, we have to experiment. But if we want to experiment, we should be experimenting in ways that avoid the National Socialist or the Communist experiment. So I think that this is where the interesting and important things are laying, and the rest is just an empirical footnote or methodological footnote to where we want to be, where we want to go. And also, and this is my last point, think about the challenges of diversity, cultural, migration, demographics, and so on. We need institutional arrangements to deal with those things. We have to think about institutional arrangements, and we don't have to experiment with all of them with real human beings in order to decide that one should be discarded or what are the probabilities and so on and so forth. So it's a practical thing. And yet, we are amassing again and again, we are going in the direction in which we try to get up this obsession with formulaic or neo-positivistic approaches to science to build up a sort of empirical basis for a universe which Dean has mentioned is a space of the possible and a space where we have moral responsibilities that we have to assume.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for taking time to be with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank our speaker for coming from DC, snow-covered DC, to sunny Indiana. And I'd like to remind you that this is the first of the two events that the Tocqueville program will devote to the Bloomington School this semester. At the end of February, I think it's February 26th, the last Friday in February, we'll be bringing to Bloomington another former student of Linnea Vincent Ostrom, Roberta Hertzberg, who taught here as well, and she's working now for the Templeton Foundation, and she'll be giving another talk on the intellectual legacy of the Ostrom. So please join me in...
A clarification, Bobby was not a former student of theirs, she was a former
colleague
of theirs here. She was first hired here.
Right. Yes.
Like I was.
Okay.
So I have a nice sense.
But you have no association with the Templeton.
Please join me in giving
That was
Actually, I think she was
well, north, not well, it depends when she was there. No, he was still